Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Armpit Intellectuals. Today we're talking about Jamaat-e-Islami, also known as JI, and how it operates as a modern political entity with deep-rooted ties to both religion and politics. Shout out to scholar Nilofer Siddiqui in her paper Gender Ideology in Jamaat-e-Islami, which was an integral source for this episode. I'm Zara.
And I'm Bilal. So Zara, let's kick things off by talking about the organizational structure of Jamaat-e-Islami. They've really modeled themselves after a modern political party, right?
Yes. The JI has a very clear and hierarchical structure with a nationwide network of departments and branches. They've consciously built this structure to function like any other political party, but with the added layer of their religious ideology.
And a big chunk of their membership comes from the urban lower middle class, particularly the youth. They've really found a niche there, especially in Pakistan's growing cities, where many young people resonate with their religious and political ideology.
Yeah, and college campuses have been a major hub for JI's training and recruitment. Even today, you'll find student groups like Islami Jamiat for young men and Islam Jamiat Talibat. Did I say that right?
Yeah, Talbat.
Thank you. For women.
Talbat.
They're not officially part of JI, but they work closely with the party to spread its message across universities.
But it wasn't always this way. JI actually started out in pre-partition India as more of a social cultural movement, not a political one. Initially, they didn't even want to get involved in politics, right?
Yes, that is correct. The founder, Maulana Maududi, had a different vision at first. He wanted to train a group of quote-unquote worker activists who would eventually create an Islamic society. And his, ultimate goal, his ultimate goal was a worldwide Islamic revolution. But with the creation of Pakistan, things shifted. JI evolved into a political party with the aim of establishing an Islamic state within Pakistan.
And Maududi himself became a hugely influential figure, not just within JI, but across the broader Islamic revivalist movement globally. His ideas really shaped the future direction of the party.
Maududi wrote over 120 books and pamphlets on a wide range of topics, from Islamic politics to social and economic issues. One of his most famous works, Purdah and the Status of Women in Islam, lovely title, I must say, published in 1972, lays the groundwork for JI's views on gender roles.
Right, and in that book, Maududi argues the relationship between men and women is the most fundamental issue for any civilization. He believed a society's progress depends on how well it defines the role of men and women.
And according to him, women should be the guardians of Islamic tradition, and their primary role is to uphold the sanctity. And it's a perspective that you can still see in JI's views on women today.
Yep, Maududi was pretty strict about this too. He believed purdah, or the segregation of the sexes, was crucial for societal progress. In his eyes, it allowed women to focus on their religious duties while men were free to work without distractions. In quotation marks, distractions.
Yes, distractions, because men are not robots. He was also critical of Western society, which he thought, I feel like, that's, goes hand in hand, which he thought had lost its moral compass because of the women's rights movements of the 19th century. And he saw this as a root cause of what he described as the moral, quote-unquote, moral decline of the West.
So much emphasis on women, right?
Yeah.
Maududi didn't just stop there. He was very specific about women's roles in both private and public life. For example, he said women could only leave their home when absolutely necessary. Social mixing between men and women, off limits.
Dang.
You ask? Social cohesion between men and women? Interaction? Purdah.
सही. अच्छा सर, लास्ट सवाल ये बताएं कि आप जमात इस्लामी कब ज्वाइन कर रहे हैं?
देखिए, अच्छा,
ये सवाल पूछने की वजह ये है,
अभी टॉन्टिंगली कह रहे हैं, मैं आपसे आज कह रहा हूँ,
मैं पूछ क्यों रहा हूँ, मैं इसलिए पूछ रहा हूँ क्योंकि आपने मेरी पॉडकास्ट में याद है, आपने कहा था कि जिस दिन जमात इस्लामी ख़वातीन को आम कपड़ों में आने की इजाज़त दे देगी मैं जमात ज्वाइन कर लूँगा. तो मैंने हाफिज नईम साहब के साथ पॉडकास्ट की, उनसे ये मैंने सवाल पूछा कि आप लोग खवातीन को आम लिबास में आने की इजाजत नहीं देते, तो उन्होंने कहा कि नहीं, ऐसा कुछ नहीं है, खवातीन
मैंने मान लिया,
अपनी मर्जी से आती
मैंने मान लिया, ठीक है, आपने बोल दिया, आपने बोल दिया। उनके 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 किसी इज्तिमा में कोई खातून, ये बच्ची जैसी बैठी है, जैसे पालों को लिपेटा हुआ है, इसके अलावा बगैर इसके लिपेटे अगर आ जाए तो मैं जमात ज्वाइन कर लूं। मैं यही तो कह रहा हूँ, समझ नहीं
कह रहे आम लिबास में आ सकते।
आम लिबास का मतलब समझे, मैं मतलब
दुपट्टा लिया हो या स्कार्फ हो ना हो,
नहीं, ये तो मुझे स्कार्फ के बगैर अगर है तो मैं जमात चला जाऊंगा।
अच्छा,
मैंने कहा ना, अगर दुपट्टा और स्कार्फ के बगैर है।
सर वो कह रहे हैं आ सकती हैं आम लिबास।
मैं पूछ रहा हूँ कि अगर कोई एक दिखा दे तस्वीर।
अच्छा, अब आप कह रहे हैं तस्वीर
दिखाए ना, मुझे जाने को तो मैं खड़ा हो जाऊं तो कौन रोक लेगा मुझे एक तस्वीर दिखा दें कि जमात के जलसे में कोई खातून, और मैंने आपको उस वक्त भी कहा था कि वो ठीक कह रहे हैं, ये उनका मसलक है, उनका सोच है, और शायद सही सोच भी है। मैं कह रहा हूँ ये उनकी सोच है, मसलक है, और शायद सही सोच भी हो कि स्कार्फ या दुपट्टे में होना चाहिए। मैं तो एग्री कर रहा हूँ, मैं डिसएग्री नहीं कर रहा, मगर ये उनका मसलक है, ठीक है। ये पाकिस्तान का लिबास नहीं है। मोहतरमा फातिमा जिन्ना ने कभी सर पे दुपट्टा नहीं लिया।
Yeah, that's right, and there were a few exceptions, however. For example, in times of war, he said purdah restrictions could be relaxed, and I think that goes beyond like just, Islamic ideology, and there was a lot more mingling during war times in most societies. And it was like during that time, women could offer support to male warriors by administering first aid, cooking food, or treating the wounded.
Interesting. But it's clear that while women weren't expected to physically fight, Maududi did see a role for them in supporting those who did.
Right. Maududi had some pretty clear ideas about where women should fit in society. He believed that men and women have different social roles based on their respective natures and physical abilities. In his view, women's activities should be separate from men's.
Yeah, and he acknowledged some real issues like women being deprived of their economic rights, especially in areas like inheritance. But his solution wasn't about giving women more independence. It was about better implementation of Islamic law.
Right. And in fact, he blamed modern society for neglecting religious duties, which he said caused women to be pushed out of their traditional roles. He felt that as modernity crept in, traditional family structures fell apart, and women were forced to work outside the home, losing their role as Islam's guardians.
Well, everyone is the guardian of Islam. Anyway, Maududi even used the term of de-womanization to describe what he thought was happening to women.
The women are being de-womanized.
He saw them as victims of societal changes that pretended to empower them, but were actually stripping away their true identity.
It's pretty interesting, because actually a lot of feminists now have this same idea about modern feminism, is that this whole idea of women, going to like, women can have children and they can also be CEOs. Like, we talked about this in a Byung-Chul Han episode.
Yeah, correct, yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting because this is actually a take that, a lot of contemporary feminists are now taking on as well.
Yeah. I mean, this could be a take or by any, any sort of conservative person. Like, you don't have to be a Maulana to have that view.
True.
Like, I mean, the people also say, right, like, by just when, like, women were, and when you say, or like, I don't know, this, like, sex positivism or whatever, like, women are now free, but like, I mean, I don't know, I think that's what they're getting at, that they're, like, they're stripping away their true identity, which is also debatable. Like,
of course, exactly,
so,
yeah.
I don't know.
Exactly, yeah. And, speaking of modernity, despite Maududi's strict views on the purdah, it's kind of surprising that Jamaat-e-Islami, the movement he founded, has a women's wing that has been active for decades and even has members in parliament. That seems like a contradiction, no?
It does. The Halke Khawateen, JI's women wing was formed in 1948. And this shift toward involving women in politics happened largely because Maududi adapted his views over time. In 1971, after JI performed poorly in elections, he realized the party wasn't engaging with enough people, especially women.
And since women had reserved seats in the National Assembly and provincial assemblies, Maududi saw an opportunity. He started encouraging JI to reach out to women as a crucial voter base.
It's interesting how he modified his ideals to fit political realities. Now we see that he's turning into like a political person rather than just a Maulana and like a religious leader. So while he claimed consistency in his beliefs, his actions showed a different story. For example, he initially opposed the creation of Pakistan, advocating for a united India. But after independence, he shifted gears.
That's a great example. And another one is his support for Fatima Jinnah in the 1965 presidential election. Fatima Jinnah wasn't just any candidate. She was an unveiled, unmarried woman. And this was a bit controversial for JI, especially since they had criticized her public appearances for violating purdah.
Exactly. But Maududi, suspicious of Ayub Khan's regime, saw it as politically necessary to back Jinnah, even though it didn't align with his earlier stance on women in leadership.
And some within the JI supported Fatima Jinnah because she was popular with the Muhajirs. That is, if you don't know who a Muhajir is or what it refers to, Muhajirs is the, Indian Muslim Urdu-speaking refugees who had a big influence in the party's support base.
But yeah, this shows how, they had to find some sort of ground so that they can themselves show their political power. I think before MKM, it was Jamaat-e-Islami.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Also, I don't know if I would call them refugees. I would
They're
probably...
not refugees.
Yeah. No, they're migrant.
Indian Muslim migrants.
Yeah, Muhajir is migrant. So that is a more accurate term.
So while Maududi backed her as a necessary evil, there's no evidence that he ever fully embraced the idea of women holding political power. It was more about political strategy than a shift in his fundamental beliefs.
And these days, JI argues that its involvement with women in politics is still consistent with Maududi's teachings. Leaders like JI's Naib Amir, that's what I thought. Dr. Khurshid Ahmed say that while supporting Fatima Jinnah was an exception, it didn't violate Islamic principles per se.
They see it as a practical decision, not a compromise. However, the general consensus in JI remains that men should lead and women should have a supporting role in politics.
So while Maududi adapted to political realities, it seems like the core ideology of JI hasn't strayed far from his original vision. That balance between religious ideals and political strategy is kind of fascinating, honestly.
It is. And it shows how even the most rigid ideologies sometimes have to bend in the face of political necessity.
खुदा की तरफ दावत देने का मुख्तसर मफ़हूम ये है जो कुरान से मालूम होता है और कुरान में दाई की अव्वलीन ख़ुसूसियत ये बयान की गई है कि उसकी दावत खालिस अल्लाह की बंदगी की तरफ हो, खालिस अल्लाह की परस्तिश और उसकी इबादत की तरफ हो, खालिस उसकी इताअत की तरफ हो और उसके कानून की पैरवी की तरफ हो। दूसरी बात जो इसमें फरमाई गई है वो ये है कि वह आमिला सालिहान नेक अमल करे। इसका जरा सा भी आदमी गौर करे तो इसका मफहूम साफ उसकी समझ में आ जाएगा कि अल्लाह की तरफ दावत देने वाले का अपना अमल अगर दुरुस्त ना हो तो फिर उसकी दावत का कोई असर नहीं हो सकता।
And that decision really shook things up. When the JI backed Jinnah, they faced serious backlash from other Muslim groups who claimed the party had abandoned its core Islamic values.
Right, some critics said the Jamaat had turned into just another political party, leaving behind its religious and social roots. And this opened the door for the government Ayub Khan to take advantage of the situation.
Yeah, Ayub's government saw an opportunity to drive a wedge between religious parties, and after the 1965 election, they even got the ulama to issue a fatwa against JI's stance on supporting a female candidate, declaring it un-Islamic.
And I think the irony is that Ayub's government, so you see the irony here, like the poor people who say that they're religious are actually supporting it, and Ayub Khan is actually not supporting
Yeah,
Fatma Jinnah.
it's pretty ironic.
So yeah, the irony is that Ayub's government, which had been criticized by religious groups for its progressive reforms on women's rights, used JI's own actions to claim the moral high ground.
And meanwhile, within the Jamaat itself, some members were questioning Maududi's authority over this issue. But for the most part, the party had become practical enough to accept this inconsistency.
Exactly. Despite supporting Fatma Jinnah in 65, the JI didn't shift its stance on women's political power in a lasting way. By the time Benazir Bhutto came into the picture in the late 80s, the JI was back to opposing female leadership.
Yes, and when Benazir's PPP tried to work with the JI to block Nawaz Sharif's influence, the JI laid out a condition. Bhutto and her mother, Begum Nusrat Bhutto, would have to be removed from the party's leadership, and this was solely because of their gender.
It's clear that the Jamaat's ideology on women, especially purdah, has often been shared by political necessity. For example, the JI established the Islami Jamaat-e-Islami, the female student wing, in response to the women's rights movement at Punjab University.
And the Talibat worked alongside the male student wing, IJT, to strengthen their influence on campuses. They clashed with progressive women's groups over issues like co-education and the demand for a separate women's university.
That's pretty cool. That clash was part of a broader campaign by conservative groups, including the JI, to promote gender segregation in education. They even had the support of Nisar Fatma, an Islamist activist who was elected to the National Assembly in 1985 with JI backing.
Yeah, Nisar Fatima was quite a force in the political landscape. She took up conservative causes, even moving to start legal action against women's rights. Her rights activist Asma Jahangir, rest in peace, for allegedly making derogatory remarks about the Prophet. This led to a fierce back and forth between Fatima's supporters and progressive women's groups.
Both sides used the same tactics: public protests, press conferences, and demonstrations. Fatma and her supporters organized mass rallies, especially in response to initiatives by progressive groups like the Women Action Forum, or WAF.
And it wasn't just rhetoric. Fatima argued that she represented the views of 90% of Pakistani women. Wow. Accusing progressive groups like
Probably not wrong.
Yeah, like the Women Action Forum of being elitist and westernized. I mean, this argument to pata nahi kab se chal raha hai कि like I knew. Yeah, I mean, it's fair, but of course, like it's good to remember that class is such a determining factor, right?
Yep.
But you also can't homogenize all, women as if they have the same beliefs and principles.
No, it's saying like 90%, but of course, like that's still like maybe a stretch.
Yeah.
But like, if you look at lower middle class and then like, like if you go above that, most of the women are like, I mean, that they say, right, in Pakistan, like religion is like, like the business of people who are a little privileged, like, Farhat Hashmi.
तो अब शौहर बीवी के साथ कैसा ताल्लुक कायम करे कि औलाद पैदा हो सके? वो ओरल सेक्स से तो नहीं हो सकता, वो एनल सेक्स से भी नहीं हो सकता. ऑब्वियसली अंडरस्टूड है कि अन्ना का मतलब यहाँ क्या है, ठीक है? यानी ये वो बातें हैं कि जिनको बहुत लफ्ज़ों को खोल खोल के नहीं बोला जा सकता, लेकिन इट्स अंडरस्टूड. तो आपने कहा जहाँ से चाहो, यानी कोई रुकावट नहीं, ममानियत नहीं. इसका ये मतलब नहीं कि नाजायज हुदूद फलांग के कहो कि इसकी भी ममानियत नहीं. अलबत्ता जब तुम खाओ तो उसे खिलाओ, ये नहीं कि शौहर खुद आउटिंग डाइनिंग के लिए चला जाए और बीवी को कहे कि बस घर में ही पका लो अपने लिए और खा लो, खुद सिर्फ दोस्तों के साथ रहे. दिस इज नॉट राइट. बीवी को भी लेके जाए.
Right.
More, a little more
Because it's the
upper
opium
class.
of the masses.
Yeah, yeah.
The
So the Action Forum fought back, arguing that JI lacked broad public support. But Fatma's influence grew as she was able to use official platforms like the National Assembly to advance her agenda.
And the tension between these two groups, progressive women and the religious right, played out in a very public way. Both sides were battling for the hearts and minds of Pakistani women.
What's interesting is that the progressive groups like WAF eventually adopted more Islamic rhetoric themselves to avoid being labeled as westernized. They introduced Quranic studies for their members and emphasized their loyalty to Islam.
However, as political scientist Aisha Jalal points out, this strategy didn't really stop the rise of social conservatism. Instead, it highlighted the growing divide between Islamic and secular women's movements.
This mirrors what we've seen in other Islamist movements like Tablighi Jamaat. A lot of Jamaat's recruitment of women happens through dars, religious study sessions where Islamic teachings are explained. Even in the National Assembly, JI's female representatives would hold these sessions in the women's lounge, inviting women from all parties to attend.
And despite their involvement in politics, the primary role of the women's wing remains religious education, particularly among housewives. So, like you mentioned, Farhat Hashmi, right?
Right.
I think that's a pretty good example.
Yeah. Her voice still haunts me in the morning.
Politics for them is secondary. That's a stark contrast to the main Jamaat-e-Islami leadership, where religion and politics are much more tightly intertwined.
That's a good point. Even though the Jamaat is a political party, religious belief is the primary motivator of its members, including the women. In rural areas of Bangladesh, for example, the Jamaat has tried to frame voting from them as equivalent to voting for God and Islam. And in Pakistan, the Jamaat has been accused of prioritizing God's interests over the people's material interests.
So for women who join the Jamaat, participation in politics seems to naturally follow their religious involvement. It's like the political role is a byproduct of the religious foundation that's been laid down by the party structure.
And that's where we see the ongoing tension between the Jamaat's vision for women's rights and the progressive women's rights movements in Pakistan. Both are engaging with the idea of modernity, but in very different ways, and both are shaping the role of women in Pakistan's political future.
The debate over women's political representation, rights, and roles within society is, of course, far from over. We know this. Whether it's the progressive activists or the women of Jamaat-e-Islami, the future of Pakistan's women will continue to be shaped how these competing visions of modernity play out.
So let's dive into one of the big points of contention when it comes to the Khawateen, which is the women's wing of Jamaat-e-Islami or JI. A lot of its recruitment actually comes from the female relatives of the JI's male members. And many critics argue that this is a clear sign that the women's wing is just a mouthpiece for the JI's male leadership. There was an opinion piece in the Daily Times that really called this out. It said the women's wing had basically accepted its B status and was unapologetic about it.
Exactly. And the article went further, pointing out that these women have historically taken some very radical positions on issues like the sexual oppression of women by men. But when they were put forward as proxies for the men, they weren't able to stick to those positions. For example, they stayed silent during the Muhtaram Mai case, a national scandal involving a gang rape.
The article concluded that the JI women's agenda has remained regressive, despite the fact that they've learned how to fit into a state that's still largely patriarchal. In fact, there have been many times when both male and female JI members in parliament have really gone after the government for not addressing these issues. A few senators like Babar Awan and Khurshid Ahmed raised concern about how police officials involved in cases of sexual harassment weren't being held accountable.
Right. But here's where things get complicated. Despite the advocacy, the JI's official stance is that the problems women face in Pakistan, like quote-unquote honor killings or gang rape, are exaggerated. I mean, sorry, only honor killing is just a little bit. It's contested. I find it personally contested just because I don't see the difference between an honor killing and like homicide. And I think honor killing is just a way that the West can, call us uncivilized and barbaric.
Okay.
I think the term honor killing is weaponized. So I say honor killing with quotes, honor in quotes killing.
Right.
Or gang rape are exaggerated, and they see it as a part of a Western narrative that's being pushed by NGOs to undermine Islam.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a recurring theme for the Jamaat. They claim that reports of violence against women are overblown and largely serve the interests of Western media. In their eyes, the situation for women is much worse in the West, where they argue that the domestic violence and sexual harassment are rampant. They're more concerned with defending traditional family roles and responsibilities than pushing for any sort of progressive reforms. The Jamaat's stance on women in politics is more about maintaining what they see as the essential Islamic nature of Pakistani society.
And that's where the tension lies. Between those who want to uphold these traditional roles and others who are fighting for more progressive changes. The role of women in politics and society continues to be a battleground in Pakistan.
And that battle doesn't look like it'll end anytime soon.
Damn, son. JI's women parliamentarians have often walked a tightrope between ideology and political representation. Going back. Tacto. They've participated in legislative assemblies, okay? But their party's stance complicates their positions on women's rights. For instance, Pakistan saw a 17% representation of women in the National Assembly and 33% in local governance. Among them, JI members were present, but they didn't necessarily see this as a positive for women's empowerment.
You'd think that more women in parliament would be a win for women's rights, but it sounds like JI's women had a different take.
Many of them argued that the reserved seats for women were too high, even unnecessary.
Too high.
Too high. Oh my God. Their stance was just that it was increasing the number of women in parliament wasn't a solution to women's issues, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
And they believe that women's participation should align with culture and religious norms and not be pursued just for the sake of equality.
Wow. Such nuance.
I know, right?
So where does this leave the broader fight for women's rights in Pakistan? It sounds like JI women are pulling things in a different direction.
Well, yeah, they're pushing a version of women's rights that's grounded in Islamic tradition rather than the more secular Western model many activists advocate for, particularly, upper class, like foreign educated elite activists, for example, right? And this creates a deep divide in Pakistani politics because, you have women who are taking on a more, I guess you could say it. I mean, of course, it's secular, right? It's secular and whatever is secular is considered just
It's
westernized.
considered Western, yeah.
Exactly.
It's so ridiculous. Not ridiculous, but it's so I would say uneducated to compare secular and Western in the same thing. Whenever they use secular, they'll just say, yeah, this is something Western, rather than looking at what is actually behind that proposal.
Mm-hmm.
Like freedom of women or whatever, or giving them more opportunities.
Right.
How is that Western thinking?
Well, I think what secularism pushes in this kind of humanistic thinking, right, is that is about separating religion from the state.
Yeah,
and for a lot of people, I mean, Pakistan was created on the basis of religion. It's like, Muslim Zion, right? Like,
No, but like secular just means that I mean,
but a core
have to-
component of secularism is
Yeah.
separating the state and religion. And that's something people cannot even comprehend, because what does that mean for a nation state like Pakistan that was literally conceived on the,
idea of a religion.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it seems like the conflict between modernity and tradition is really at the heart of this, right?
Mhm.
And the
And
role of women is a battleground for that struggle. And the rise of religious conservatism, even among women, complicates the narrative that women's rights are simply about liberation from male dominance. It's much deeper, right? It's tied to cultural, religious, and political identities. And as we've seen, it's far from being resolved.
Well, that's it for today's deep dive. The role of women in politics, especially within religious parties like JI, is a complex and evolving story.
Yep. Thanks for joining us from the Pits of Knowledge once again. We'll be back next time with more discussions on how politics and society shape each other.
Till next time.
Peace.